New Zealand spent 90 years trying to kill this plant. Parliament outlawed it in 1900. Farmers sprayed it, burned it, bulldozed it, and every single time it came back thicker. 3 meters tall, wall to wall, swallowing whole hillsides while they watched. Then in 1987, on 109 hectares of dead farmland on Banks Peninsula, one botanist did the only thing nobody had ever tried. He left it standing. Every yellow acre.
Why are you restoring the forest? In a way, saying why you're doing it is like saying, why should you love your mother? That's what a sort of parallel. We're totally dependent on vegetation and the wildlife it supports for our own lives.
His neighbors mailed him letters predicting ruin within a decade. 39 years later, that land is 1,700 hectares of native forest, and the weed is almost gone. Nobody killed it, and nobody saw what it had really been doing out there. The refusal. You need to see what he was standing on. This was not tired farmland. Tired farmland grows thin grass. This was a farm that had lost a war. 53% of the property had closed over into gorse canopy. 3 meters tall, wall to wall, chest deep in thorns. The pasture underneath was gone. There was nothing left to save. And Wilson looked at it and said he was leaving it alone. Not clearing it slowly, not managing it lightly, leaving it on purpose, as the plan. Understand how that landed. Gorse seed travels. Gorse seed sits in soil for decades, waiting. Every farmer on that peninsula now believed they were living downwind of a man who had just built a seed factory and aimed it at their valleys. And they were not being dramatic. On Banks Peninsula in 1987, gorse was the thing that took your land. It came up the gullies. It took the steep faces first, because that is where the machinery cannot go. Then it walked downhill into your flats while you watched. Farms had been abandoned over it. Families had been broken by it. There were valleys where people said the word gorse the way you say the name of a disease. So the reaction was not disagreement. It was closer to grief. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in the Aotearoa mail, and it was only the first one. 90 years. Here is what gorse meant in New Zealand. It came from Britain in the 1800s as a hedge plant. That is all it was at home. A living fence, cheap, tough, spiny. Then it got to New Zealand and found no gorse eating anything, mild wet winters, and hillsides of freshly cleared, freshly grazed, freshly ruined soil. It went off like a match in dry grass. By 1900, the New Zealand Parliament had classed it as a noxious weed. And for the next 87 years, the official advice never really changed. Kill it. Kill it with fire. Kill it with sprays. Kill it with heavy machinery. And when it comes back, it will kill it harder next season. The farmer who owned that land before Wilson did all of it. He sprayed the paddocks. He bulldozed hillsides. He slashed it by hand until his arms gave out. He burned fire breaks along the ridges. Every method he used made the gorse come back thicker, faster, over more ground. Stop on that. Not that he failed, that the harder he fought, the better his enemy did. He was not losing to gorse. He was feeding it. Fire cracks gorse seed open and tells it to germinate. Bulldozing scarifies the soil and hands it bare ground, which is exactly what gorse wants, and exactly what native forest does not. 90 years of national policy had built a machine for growing gorse, and everybody called it weed control. Nobody had ever asked the other question, not once, because asking it out loud made you sound insane. What happens if you just stop? The accountant. The only reason anybody got to ask it was a man named Maurice White. And he was not a scientist. He was a Christchurch accountant. Since 1977, he had been quietly putting money aside. Not for a house, not for retirement. To buy land and hand it back to native birds. He had no botanical training and no illusions about it. What he had was a trust fund and the sense to hire someone who knew what he was looking at. Hugh Wilson was that someone. 7 years surveying the plants of Aoraki Mount Cook. 5 years cataloging Stewart Island. And he had just finished a full botanical survey of Banks Peninsula itself for the Department of Conservation. Nobody alive knew that coastlines plants better, which meant nobody alive knew exactly how much was gone. Before Europeans arrived, this peninsula was closed native forest from summit to sea, unbroken canopy the whole way down. By 1987, less than 1% of that old growth was left anywhere on Banks Peninsula. 1%. 99% of everything that lived there. Gone. Not damaged, not thinned, gone. So Wilson did not walk into that gorse as a dreamer. He walked in as the man who had counted the bodies. And on that survey, he had already seen something nobody else had. Under the thorns, nobody else had seen it for a very simple reason. You cannot walk into a gorse thicket. That is the entire point of a gorse thicket. But Wilson was a surveyor. Surveyors go in anyway. And under the gorse, in the shade the thorns were casting, on ground everybody had written off as dead, native seedlings were coming up. Nobody planted them. Nobody tended them. Kanuka, maho, fuchsia, wineberry, lemonwood, five-finger. Species that could not survive 5 minutes out in open pasture were quietly establishing themselves inside a wall of introduced weeds in the dark, where nobody had bothered to look. That is the whole story in one frame. The most hated plant in the country was running a native nursery in its own shadow, and it had probably been doing it for years. If stories like this are why you are here, subscribe. One goes up every week. So, where were those seedlings coming from? Not nowhere. Banks Peninsula had less than 1% of its forest left. But 1% is not zero. There were remnants, pockets hanging on in the steepest gullies, in folds too awkward to clear, in places the fire and the axe never quite reached. Little islands of the old world, and birds use them. A carreru eats fruit in a remnant gully, flies out over a hillside of gorse, and does what birds do. Wind carries the small seed. So every one of those thorny acres was sitting under a slow, invisible rain of native seed. Landing on soil, the gorse had already fed. In shade, the gorse was already casting. Behind thorns, no sheep could push through. The forest was not gone from that hillside. It was queued up. Wilson did not celebrate. He needed to know why it worked. And the answer was a piece of biology that 90 years of weed policy had never once been asked to consider. What gorse is? Gorse is a legume. That is it. That is the secret. It was in every botany textbook the entire time, like clover, like beans, like peas. Gorse pulls nitrogen out of the air and pumps it into the soil through its roots. On land stripped to the bone by a century of grazing, land with nothing left in it, gorse is the first thing that will fertilize the ground, back up to a state where anything else can grow at all. The weed was not destroying the soil. The weed was rebuilding it. Now the second thing, a mature gorse thicket, 3 meters tall and solid with thorns, is a fortress. Impassable to sheep, impassable to cattle, impassable to deer and goats. Nothing with a mouth gets through. So look at what is actually happening under there. Fed soil, total protection from anything that eats seedlings, and deep permanent shade, every single condition a native seedling needs, provided free. By the plant the entire country was trying to poison. But that is only half of it. The half that made Hugh Wilson bet the rest of his life on this hillside is what the gorse does next. And it is the part his neighbors flatly refused to believe was possible. The collapse mechanism. Wilson published it in the New Zealand Journal of Botany in 1994. It reads less like botany and more like a con being run in slow motion. Gorse grows fast, explosively fast, for the first few years. Then it hits a wall. After roughly 10 years, its own stems start to collapse under their own weight. The solid canopy begins to open, and light comes down. Onto ground, the gorse has already fertilized and already protected for a decade. Now, here is the trap the plant has built for itself. Gorse cannot regenerate in shade. It needs full sun. It has to have it. But the seedlings underneath, the ones the birds dropped, the ones the wind carried, are shade tolerant. That is what they are built for. That is what a forest floor is. So they come up through the collapsing gorse. They reach it, they pass it, they close over the top of it, and they cut the sun off from the plant that raised them. And the gorse dies. It rots down into the forest floor and composts itself into the soil, feeding the trees that killed it. It fertilizes the ground. It guards the seedlings. It shades them in. Then it hands the hillside over and disappears into it. Read that again. The plant 90 years of government policy could not kill with fire, poison, or machinery kills itself. Reliably, on a schedule, for free. As long as you let it finish the job. And this is the part nobody saw coming. Not the farmers, not the council, not parliament, not 87 years of national weed policy. Everybody in that country was looking at a wall of thorns and seeing the end of a hillside. One man looked at the same wall and saw scaffolding. The fastest known route back to native forest on Banks Peninsula was the thing everybody was spraying. Wilson wrote it down. He explained it plainly to the people around him. And the peninsula went to war. The letters. The letter that came in the Acre mail 2 weeks after he announced his plan called him a fool and a dreamer. It said, "Heaven help us from people like him." It said the land would be ruined inside a decade. It said the gorse would spread across the whole peninsula and bankrupt every farm from Christchurch to the sea. It was one of many. And understand, these were not stupid people. These were 4th and 5th generation farmers who had watched gorse take paddock after paddock their entire lives. They had fought it personally. They had lost personally. Their read on the biology of gorse was completely correct. Local government regulations required Wilson to keep clearing gorse along his boundaries. So he did. A strip along the fence line, not 1 meter more. Every year the council came and checked. Every year he passed, on a technicality, by a meter of cleared fence line. Every year the neighbors stood at their fences and watched the inside of that property go yellow, then yellower, then solid gold to the horizon. One neighbor, a farmer whose family had worked the next valley for 4 generations, later told a documentary crew about walking in on an open day as a kid in the 90s. What he remembered was that you could see nothing but bright yellow all the way out. Every farmer on that peninsula was quietly certain the seed was coming for them. And then the weather turned, and Wilson had to decide what kind of neighbor he actually was. The drought. In 1988, Banks Peninsula went into the worst drought recorded in a generation. The paddocks turned to dust. Cattle were starving on the neighboring properties. There was nothing anyone could do, and the man they all blamed for the future of their land was sitting on the one place still holding grass. Hugh Wilson opened his gate. He let the neighboring farmer graze his starving cattle on the parts of the reserve where the grass was still hanging on. The man, supposedly destroying everyone's livelihood, fed his neighbor's herd through the worst drought of their lives. That farmer became a lifelong friend. For a long time, he was the only one. And the friendship did not change a single thing about what came next, because what came next was 9 years of nothing. 9 years. In 1991, the Maurice White Trust bought 870 hectares of Otanerito Station next door and folded it into the reserve. The workload jumped nearly tenfold overnight. Wilson was now responsible for over 1,000 hectares of the steepest, most remote country on the peninsula. He did not own a car. He cycled the 90-kilometer round trip from Christchurch roughly every 10 days. Eventually, he moved onto the land itself, into a solar-powered cabin, and stayed. And then, nothing happened. From 1988 to 1997, the gorse looked exactly the same as the day he arrived. The neighbors were still furious. The letters kept coming. Wilson kept publishing careful scientific papers that not one person on that peninsula was reading. 9 years of standing in front of a hillside that will not prove you right. 9 years of being the local joke, on a bicycle, in the rain, with a theory. And he could not point at anything. That is the part nobody tells you about long experiments. There is no halfway. The hill either does it or it does not. And it does not tell you which one it is doing while you wait. He did not adjust the plan. He did not compromise. Animals out, fire out, wait. He had told them 10 years. He was running out of 10 years. The turn. In 1997, the thing the farmers had sworn was impossible started to show up. The gorse on the oldest paddocks began to fall over. Not everywhere, in patches. Exactly where the Kanuka and Maho had come up first. Exactly as predicted. Exactly on schedule. The canopy opened, light hit the ground, and native seedlings pushed up through the wreckage of the thing that raised them. The farmer next door, the same one whose cattle grazed there in the drought, said later that he had assumed the succession from gorse to native forest would take 50 years, if it happened at all. Within 10, he could see them coming through in places he had not known any native growth existed. That is where the argument ended, not with a paper, not with a council ruling, with a hillside quietly doing the thing and everybody said hillsides could not do. But an opinion changing is not evidence. Wilson had been photographing that hillside since 1988, and he had not shown anyone what the camera had. 28 years. In 2016, researchers went back and repeated the photo point surveys Wilson started in 1988. Same fixed points, same angles, same hillsides. Put the two frames side by side. October 1988. Pale grass and dense yellow gorse falling away toward the sea. Solid, hopeless. October 2016, from the exact same spot. Closed native forest. Kanuka, canopy above head height. Tree ferns underneath, and no visible gorse anywhere in the frame. None. 28 years between those photographs. Nothing was planted between them. Nobody sprayed anything. Nobody cleared anything. The only thing any human being did to that hillside was refuse to touch it. So, the farmers were not wrong about gorse. Their biology was sound. They were wrong about the biology of everything around it. And the thing they missed is almost stupidly simple. What they missed. As long as sheep and cattle are on the land, gorse spreads and native seedlings get eaten the second they appear. Undergrazing, gorse is permanent because nothing is ever allowed to grow tall enough to shade it out. The farmers were right. Under their conditions, gorse genuinely is forever. Take the grazing animals off, every one of them, and gorse stops being a permanent invader and becomes a temporary structure that builds its own replacement and then disappears. Same plant, same soil, same rainfall. One variable, sheep. The weed was never the problem. The weed was the answer. The animals were holding the answer down, which raises the obvious question. If the plan is to do nothing, what exactly was Hugh Wilson doing out there for 4 decades? Minimal interference. He took the stock off, then the possums, the goats, the deer. He kept the fire out. Beyond that, almost nothing. He calls it minimal interference management, which is a very polite name for a very radical idea. In practice, the reserve's entire restoration budget across 4 decades has gone to fencing, control of a short list of genuinely dangerous invasive species, and possum trapping. Not tree planting, not spraying, not earthworks. A recent trapping operation across the reserve took 29 possums in 14 days. Goats have not been seen inside the boundary in over a decade. That is the job. Keep the mouths out. Keep the fire out. Get out of the way. That is the entire method, and it fits in 3 lines. Most restoration is a fight against a landscape. This was a decision to stop fighting one. And before anyone takes that idea home and runs it on their own back paddock, there is an honest limit to this story, and Wilson has never once hidden it. Where it works. This is not a universal law. It is a result from one place, under a specific set of conditions. Banks Peninsula is wet enough and mild enough to push a forest through fast. There were native seed sources still standing within reach in those remnant gullies. The land was steep marginal country that was never going to make anyone rich as pasture, and somebody was able to remove every grazing animal from 1,000 hectares and keep them out permanently, which is not something most landowners can do or want to do. Change one of those, and the outcome changes. On a dry site, with no native seed for kilometers, gorse left alone is likely to stay gorse for a very long time. The neighbors were not wrong about their land, they were wrong about this land. That distinction is the whole discipline of Wilson's work, and it gets lost every time the story gets shared. He never claimed gorse is good. He claimed that on this hillside, under these conditions, with the animals gone, gorse is a stage. And the correct response to a stage is patience, not poison. So, what does 39 years of patience actually buy you? The numbers are hard to hold in your head. The numbers. As of 2026, Hinawai Reserve covers 1,700 hectares. Roughly 4% of that is old-growth native forest, 6 times the average for the rest of Banks Peninsula, which sits at about 0.7%. Around 350 native plant species have been documented there, 60 species of fern, 6 of them tree ferns, 35 native bird species recorded, including tui, bellbird, brown creeper, rifleman, kareru, and the New Zealand falcon, which came back on its own. Nobody released it, it found forest again and moved in. 47 waterfalls now flow year-round, up from a handful. Give that one a second, because it is not decoration. A bare-grazed hillside sheds rain. It hits hard ground, runs off fast, takes the topsoil with it, and by February your creeks are dry stones. Forest does the opposite. Canopy slows the rain, roots open the ground, leaf litter holds it like a sponge, and the hill lets it go slowly, all year. 47 permanent waterfalls is a hillside that has relearned how to hold water. And the reserve now earns roughly 1 million New Zealand dollars a year in carbon credits under the emissions trading scheme, plus donations and walking track revenue, without a single planted tree. Now, here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Wilson called almost all of this in advance, in writing, while the gorse was still standing. The prediction. His 1994 paper made a forecast. By 2050, 95% of the reserve would be native forest, 4% old growth, only 1% still scrub or tussock on the exposed bluffs. He wrote that while the gorse stood 3 meters tall across half the property. He wrote it while his neighbors were mailing him letters calling him a dreamer. Every peer-reviewed survey since has tracked closer to that prediction than any restoration project on the peninsula using the conventional method. Spray, clear, plant. Everybody on that peninsula had 90 years of hard experience with gorse. Experience is not nothing, but experience only tells you what happens under the conditions you have always had. Change one condition, and every hour of it quietly stops applying. And nobody notices, because nobody ever tries. But a forecast on paper is one thing. Nobody expected the forest to start leaving the property. The birds spread. A forest does not stay inside your fence. The farmer who let his cattle graze there in the drought watched his own son start recording tomtits in their valley. A bird his family had not seen there in decades. The birds pushed outward from the center of Hinawai, valley by valley. As the canopy thickened, they took back ground nobody asked them to take. Marie Haley, whose family has farmed the neighboring property for 7 generations, now runs guided tours through the reserve. The people who wrote the letters, or their children, are walking visitors through the thing the letters were written to stop. And the man who caused all of it is still up the hill, in the same cabin, doing what he has always done. The cabin. Hugh Wilson is 81 years old. He still lives in the cabin on the property. He still writes and illustrates the reserve's newsletter by hand on paper and mails it to 2,000 supporters. He has never planted a tree, not one. 4 decades, 1,700 hectares. The most cited restoration project in the Southern Hemisphere. Trees put in that ground by human hands. 0. Think about what that actually took, not the botany. The botany was published, checked, correct. The waiting. 9 years of a hillside that would not move, while every person you lived beside told you that you were destroying their future, being right the whole time, and having no way to show it. He was not doing nothing. That is the misunderstanding at the center of this entire story. He was doing the hardest thing there is, refusing to intervene in a system that already knows how to heal, and holding that line for 40 years while the evidence caught up. 2 photographs, 28 years apart, same fixed point above the Otanerito Valley. A wall of yellow thorns and a wall of dark green forest. Nothing planted between them, nothing sprayed. One man took his hands off. If this changed how you think about what land can do when you leave it alone, subscribe. One of these goes up every week. Like the video if it was worth your time. And tell me in the comments, what is the thing in your world that might fix itself if everybody would just stop trying to fix it?